The will reading room fell dead silent the second my uncle announced my removal from the entire family estate. They expected tears, begging, or a complete meltdown at that walnut table in front of all our relatives. I simply looked straight at the estate attorney and smiled. Lawyer, you really don't know. No one in that room realized my erasure was not their victory. It was the exact trigger required for their complete financial collapse. My name is Riley Roberts. I am 34 years old, and I was sitting perfectly still, about to watch my family attempt to erase my existence. The air inside the historic Charleston mansion was heavy with the suffocating scent of lemon oil, old money, and poorly concealed greed. Outside, the brutal South Carolina heat choked the Spanish moss draping the ancient live oaks, but inside the sprawling library, the temperature was perfectly, artificially chilled. Over 20 people crammed into the cavernous space. There were relatives I only saw at catered events, former business partners with their eyes glued to the prize, and the kind of socialite friends who could smell blood in the water from a mile away. They were not dressed in mourning. They were dressed for a coronation. I sat at the absolute farthest edge of the massive mahogany dining table. I wore a tailored black sheath dress, entirely devoid of jewelry, offering a stark, sharp contrast to the pastel linen suits and diamond tennis bracelets glittering around the room. I was the blood niece of the deceased, yet I was positioned geographically and metaphorically as the hired help. The outsider. The stray they had tolerated for optics. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. My pulse rested at a calm, steady beat. Uncle Owen Mercer did not even wait for the estate attorney to finish his tedious legal preamble. Owen stood up. He buttoned his bespoke charcoal suit jacket, clearing his throat loudly enough to swallow the room's murmurs. He physically leaned over the table, casting a literal shadow over Leonard Pike, the highly paid, highly nervous estate lawyer who sat staring rigidly at his leather-bound folder. "Let us save everyone the legal fatigue," Owen announced. His voice was a booming baritone, practiced in brutal boardrooms and exclusive country clubs. The core of the Mercer legacy requires steady, visionary hands to navigate the current market. Therefore, the commercial portfolio will be transferred entirely to my son, Grant. Owen listed the assets not as legal items, but as conquered territories. The entire cold storage network sprawling across the eastern seaboard, the highly lucrative commercial retail blocks in downtown Charleston, the controlling shares of Mercer Logistics, every single pillar of the family empire, handed over in one breath to a man whose only business experience was crashing imported sports cars and losing millions in boutique restaurant ventures. I did not flinch. I just watched the room. As for Riley, Owen continued, he turned his head just slightly to look down his nose at me. The room fell into an expectant, cruel hush. Riley is a smart girl, but she is simply not a fit for the brutal realities of the family business. She lacks the Mercer Constitution. However, we honor family in this house. She will receive the designated boxes of family memorabilia currently residing in the basement archives. Sentimental value is, after all, priceless. A ripple of sheer amusement swept through the library. Someone snorted softly. Several people actually chuckled aloud. Across the table, a distant cousin raised a heavy crystal glass of bourbon in a silent, mocking toast toward Grant. It was a public execution of my standing, a theatrical performance designed to humiliate me so thoroughly I would never dare show my face in this town again. Leonard Pike tugged at his silk tie. He looked intensely uncomfortable, a bright bead of sweat forming at his temple, but he cleared his throat and continued reading from the heavily redacted file in front of him. He read the clauses, the distributions, the absolute finality of it all, acting exactly as if this brutal disinheritance was standard operating procedure. He was reading a script Owen had likely finalized over expensive scotch days ago. Grant Mercer slouched in his high-backed leather chair, radiating an unearned, toxic arrogance. He draped a heavy arm over the bare shoulders of his fiancée, Talia Boone. Talia smiled perfectly, her eyes vacant but predatory. Grant leaned in, his lips brushing Talia's ear, but his voice was intentionally loud enough to carry across the polished wood to where I sat. "Finally put in her proper place," Grant whispered, his gaze locking onto mine with malicious glee. "Back to the mailroom." I held his gaze. I did not blink. Then came the final move. The kill shot Owen had prepared just to watch me bleed. Owen picked up a thick stack of stapled documents from his side of the table. He did not hand it to me. He placed it flat on the wood and slid it hard. The paper scraped harshly against the mahogany, sliding down the long expanse of the table until it stopped exactly in front of my folded hands. "Since you are family," Owen said, his tone dripping with weaponized pity, "you still have obligations." The logistics firm took a sudden, massive hit this quarter. A payroll tax penalty. You are still technically listed as a financial officer on the old registry. You need to sign this emergency support authorization to release your personal liquid assets to cover the fine. It has to be paid within 24 hours to avoid federal liens. Sign it, Riley. It is the absolute least you can do after everything this family has provided for you. It was a financial trap of breathtaking audacity. He had just stripped me of my generational wealth, publicly humiliated me in front of the town's elite, and now he was demanding I drain my own hard-earned personal savings to plug a gaping, bleeding hole in the company accounting. A hole I knew for a fact Grant had created just 2 months prior to fund his lifestyle. Owen wanted me destitute. He wanted me broken. He wanted me to sign away my safety net in a state of panicked, tearful compliance. The entire room watched me. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for the desperate outburst. They were waiting for me to pick up a pen and sign away my own future just to desperately scrape together a tiny sliver of their conditional approval. I did not argue. I did not reach for the silver pen resting beside the document. I did not even look at the paper. Instead, I shifted my gaze away from Owen's triumphant sneer. I looked directly at the man sweating in his expensive suit. I looked at the man who held the legal authority in the room, but possessed none of the actual power. I leaned forward, just a fraction of an inch. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but in that breathless, silent room, it cut through the heavy air like a scalpel hitting bone. "Lawyer, you really don't know." The shift in the room was violent. It was not a physical movement, but a sudden, terrifying change in the atmospheric pressure. Owen Mercer's smug, practiced smile vanished in a fraction of a second. The color drained completely from his face, replaced instantly by an ugly mottled red. The absolute control he had wielded just moments before shattered into pieces. "What are you talking about?" Owen demanded. He slammed his hand flat on the table, the sharp sound making Talia Boone jump in her seat. His voice lost its baritone polish, cracking into a harsh, panicked bark. "What do you know?" "Sign the damn paper, see?" I did not answer him. I slowly stood up from the heavy oak chair. I smoothed down the front of my black dress, ensuring not a single wrinkle remained. I left the thick stack of papers sitting perfectly untouched on the mahogany surface. Without a single glance back at my uncle, my cousin, or the audience who had gathered to watch my ruin, I turned on my heel. I walked across the priceless Persian rug, my footsteps echoing sharp and definitive against the hardwood border, and I walked out of the heavy double doors into the hallway, leaving nothing behind me but a suffocating, terrifying silence. The heavy door of my sedan thudded shut, sealing me inside a sudden, pristine quiet. The oppressive heat of the afternoon beat against the tinted glass, but the air conditioning quickly kicked in, chilling the sweat on my collarbone. Before I could even shift the car into drive, my phone lit up the center console. The screen vibrated with a relentless, angry energy. I picked it up. A direct message from Grant sat at the top of my notifications. The preview text was enough to tell me he was already drinking in celebration. I swiped to open it. "Just so we are crystal clear," the message read, "you are nothing but the hired help raised out of pity in this house. You do not get to walk out and play the victim. Transfer the penalty funds by tomorrow morning, or I will personally make sure every partner, vendor, and socialite in this city knows exactly what an ungrateful leech you are. Do not test me." Right beneath his threat, The extended family group chat was detonating. The notification badge climbed past 30, then 40 unread messages in the span of a single minute. I scrolled through the vitriol. Aunt Beatrice was lamenting my lack of grace and complaining about how I was ruining the family face in front of the estate attorney. A cousin I had not spoken to in 3 years chimed in to call me wildly ungrateful for the roof Owen had generously kept over my head. They spun narratives of my supposed arrogance. They demanded I apologize for causing a scene. Out of 47 messages, not a single person asked if I was all right. A normal person might have shattered right there in the leather driver's seat. A normal person might have fired back a desperate, furious defense or broken down into heavy, weeping sobs. I did neither. I engaged the parking brake, took a slow, measured breath, and began to work. I took precise screenshots of Grant's threats. I captured the entire thread of the family group chat, meticulously scrolling to ensure no comment was missed. I downloaded the digital copy of the penalty payment request Owen had emailed to me just hours prior. I routed everything into a secure, time-stamped cloud directory on my phone. To me, these were no longer family members throwing a tantrum. They were hostile actors generating a paper trail. The drive back to Mount Pleasant took exactly 22 minutes. I crossed the massive cable-stayed bridge, leaving the suffocating history of the peninsula behind me. My apartment was on the top floor of a sleek, modern complex. It was everything the Mercer estate was not. It was minimalistic, deeply quiet, and completely under my own control. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights when I walked through the door. The evening sun was already bleeding out below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the hardwood floor. I dropped my keys on the granite counter, walked straight to my home office, and woke up my primary workstation. The twin monitors flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my face in the darkened room. I bypassed the standard login and accessed a heavily encrypted, nested folder system I had been quietly building for the past 4 years. The Mercer family thought I was just a glorified bookkeeper, a pathetic, number-crunching spinster they could bully into submission. They did not know, or simply did not care to understand, what I actually did for a living at Northline Ledger Forensics. As a senior forensic financial investigator, my daily reality did not revolve around simple tax returns or balancing basic ledgers. I spent my days hunting ghosts in corporate architecture, unearthing millions of dollars hidden in shell companies, and dismantling complex fraud networks for federal agencies and private equity firms. When a crisis hit, my neurological response was not panic or grief. It was an immediate, chilling shift into procedural analysis. I built timelines. I secured the chain of custody. I locked down exposure. I pulled up the financial documents Owen had tried to force on me at the table. I ran the numbers. It took me less than 10 minutes of cross-referencing with the corporate filings I already had on record to see the ugly, desperate truth. The sudden payroll tax penalty was not a genuine operational oversight or a moral obligation. It was an artificially accelerated liability. Owen was bleeding cash from the logistics firm to cover a newly created accounting black hole, likely tied to Grant's failed restaurant ventures. With a quarterly compliance audit looming in less than 14 days, Owen was terrified. He was trying to legally strong-arm my personal savings to plug his felony-level deficit, using the emotional shock of a disinheritance as a smokescreen. My phone buzzed loudly against the desk. The caller identification displayed Leonard Pike. I stared at the lawyer's name illuminating the dark room. He was calling back fast. Too fast. I let it ring. I did not pick it up. I needed him to stew in his own anxiety. I needed to know if he was frantically calling because he had suddenly realized his firm was exposed to massive legal malpractice, or if he was just trying to manage his high society reputation after my dramatic exit. Letting it go to voicemail gave me the upper hand. Instead of answering, I opened a separate audio application on my desktop. Before stepping into the library today, I had activated a discreet, high-fidelity recording device in my purse. South Carolina is a one-party consent state, but to ensure absolute bulletproof legality in a civil proceeding, I had relied on a secondary layer of protection. The formal event notice mailed to all attendees last week explicitly stated that the reading was a matter of corporate record and would be documented for absentee stakeholders. They had all consented by simply walking into the room. I scrubbed through the digital waveform, passing the drone of the lawyer and the mocking whispers of my cousin. I stopped the playback right at the moment Owen had stood up to claim his victory. I enhanced the audio, isolating his booming baritone from the background noise. I hit play. The core of the Mercer legacy requires steady, visionary hands. Owen's recorded voice echoed in the quiet of my apartment. Then came the crucial sentence, the one I had been waiting years to hear him say on the record. I am accepting the transfer of the commercial portfolio, which is completely clean and uncontested, to be managed as our sole and absolute property. I paused the track. I listened to the dead air in my office. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the sound wave frozen on the monitor. A slow, genuine smile broke across my face, the very first one I had allowed myself all night. Owen thought he was hammering the final nail into my coffin. He had no idea that his arrogant, boastful declaration of owning a clean and uncontested title was the exact legal mechanism required to trigger a hidden covenant. It was a covenant he never even knew existed, and his words had just armed the bomb. Gemini said my mother, Elaine Roberts, passed away on a rainy Tuesday when I was exactly 22 years old. Almost before the dirt settled over her grave, my uncle began actively rewriting our family history. At every holiday dinner, charity gala, and country club mixer, he spun a masterful, deeply tragic tale of his own martyrdom. He carried the entire weight of the clan on his broad shoulders. He claimed to anyone who would listen. In his version of events, I was merely the unfortunate, orphaned niece he had graciously taken under his wing out of pure familial duty. It was a highly compelling narrative for his wealthy golf buddies. It was also entirely fabricated. The actual truth was buried deep within the corporate registry of the early 2000s. Back then, the logistics firm was practically bankrupt, suffocating under a mountain of bad commercial loans and my uncle's catastrophic mismanagement. It was my mother who stepped in. She injected the massive, strategic capital required to save the entire operation from absolute liquidation. Yet, over the subsequent years, her name was methodically and ruthlessly scrubbed from the origin story, replaced entirely by the grand myth of my uncle's solitary financial genius. I learned the exact mechanics of this historical erasure firsthand. When I first started my career as a junior data analyst right out of college, my uncle would frequently call me on a Sunday afternoon, his tone dripping with false camaraderie, asking for a quick, simple favor. He needed a fresh set of eyes on a confusing tax discrepancy. He needed someone to quickly untangle a cash flow bottleneck before the commercial banks opened on Monday morning. I always agreed, foolishly believing I was genuinely helping my family and earning my rightful place at the table. That quick favor rapidly metastasized into an unpaid, deeply demanding secondary career that dragged on for over 7 years. I was routinely executing high-level forensic reconciliations, restructuring their complex debt profiles, reconciling phantom invoices, and shielding them from severe audit penalties. But within the walls of the estate, my exhausting labor was aggressively downgraded. It was treated as a basic household chore, no different than picking up the dry cleaning or taking out the trash. I worked grueling 60-hour weeks at my actual corporate firm, only to spend my weekends fixing his bleeding ledgers. I was never compensated at fair market rate. I was never officially recognized on the company letterhead or given a single ounce of equity for the millions of dollars I saved them in compliance fines. I spent countless, agonizing evenings sitting across from him in his overly decorated, mahogany-paneled office. I would slide comprehensive risk management proposals and efficiency models across his polished desk. I pleaded with him to standardize the outdated accounting software, to implement basic, fundamental compliance checks before a federal regulatory agency noticed the massive discrepancies. He waved me off every single time with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Good corporate governance was boring to him. My uncle only cared about maintaining a glossy, high-net-worth illusion. His primary goal was to shield my cousin's disastrous, deeply embarrassing lifestyle from their elite social circle and highly judgmental private investors. My cousin bled company capital like an open artery. He funneled restricted corporate funds into platinum-tier country club memberships, excessive luxury vacations to Europe, and a revolving door of half-baked startup ideas that never survived past a second quarter. Every single time he created a massive, glaring deficit, my uncle refused to hold him accountable. Instead, he simply slashed the legitimate operational budgets, delayed essential vendor payments, and then pushed the immense pressure entirely onto my shoulders. I was expected to magically balance a ledger that was fundamentally, structurally broken, all while smiling and playing the grateful, quiet dependent. The ultimate breaking point did not happen in a screaming match. It happened quietly, on a mundane afternoon in late October. I had finally drafted a highly detailed, extremely conservative business plan for my own independent financial consulting firm. I needed exactly $35,000 for specialized software licenses, initial marketing, and a tiny office lease. It was a microscopic fraction of the money the company burned in a single month on useless vanity projects. I sat down with my uncle, presented my incredibly thorough projections, and asked for a simple, structured loan with a legally binding interest rate. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, laughed right in my face, and flatly told me I lacked the aggressive, killer instinct required to survive on my own in the brutal business world. He advised me to stay put, keep my head down, and be incredibly grateful for the immense stability he so generously provided me. Exactly 3 days later, I watched from the second-floor window as my cousin pulled into the corporate driveway in a brand-new, customized, six-figure Italian sports car. The engine roared, rattling the glass panes of the building. My uncle had purchased the vehicle in full, claiming to the executive board that it was a necessary business expense to encourage his son's entrepreneurial spirit and project an image of supreme success. I stood perfectly still by the window, watching the afternoon sun glint off the pristine paint job, and an icy, absolute clarity finally settled into my bones. I finally understood the core dynamic of my existence in this family. They did not dismiss me because I was weak or incompetent. They kept me small, underpaid, and entirely dependent precisely because I was the single most competent person in their entire orbit. I was the reliable, silent beast of burden that kept their fragile, rotting empire from collapsing under the immense weight of their own sheer incompetence. You absolutely do not free the workhorse if you still desperately need the fields plowed. I never argued with my uncle again after that day. I completely stopped asking for his validation. I stopped expecting basic fairness or familial love. Instead, I adopted a single, cold, unbreakable rule to govern every aspect of my life. Do not react until you have the paperwork. I smiled warmly at family dinners. I quietly and efficiently fixed their glaring accounting errors. And while they slept off their expensive hangovers, I methodically mapped every single dark, hidden corner of their sprawling financial structure. I became a ghost in their machine. It was this exact, emotionless discipline that eventually led me down to the basement archives of the main estate. It was a damp, forgotten, poorly lit space filled with decades of dust-covered banker boxes that my uncle arrogantly assumed were completely obsolete. The air down there smelled of mildew, deteriorating cardboard, and old secrets. He thought history was simply whatever narrative he said out loud to his friends. He fundamentally forgot that true, undeniable history is always written down, waiting quietly in the dark for someone patient enough to read it. Gemini said, "The heavy reinforced cardboard box had been sitting in the climate-controlled storage closet of my apartment for exactly 3 months. I had quietly extracted it from the damp, forgotten basement of the family estate long before the funeral, sensing its importance without fully knowing its contents. Now, bathed in the harsh blue light of my dual monitors, I finally cut through the brittle yellowed packing tape. The distinctive smell of dry, aging paper and institutional dust filled the quiet room. Inside lay the remnants of my mother's professional life. There were thick stacks of bank correspondence printed on heavy bond paper, dating back to a time before everything was outsourced to sterile digital servers. There were bound corporate meeting minutes from the early 2000s, meticulously typed out and officially stamped. I sifted through the layers of obsolete tax ledgers and faded depreciation schedules, my hands moving with practiced forensic efficiency. Near the very bottom, beneath a heavy manila folder, my fingers brushed against something different. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a heavy press of deep red wax, a surprisingly archaic and fiercely deliberate touch for a woman whose entire existence was governed by modern spreadsheets. Across the front, written in my mother's elegant, slanted handwriting, were exactly 6 words. Only if they erase you. I did not hesitate. I broke the wax seal. The contents were not a sentimental goodbye letter or a collection of maternal advice. It was a heavily notarized, deeply complex legal instrument. The header identified it as a secured convertible promissory note, executed between my mother and the original corporate entity of the logistics firm. I read through the dense legal jargon, my eyes rapidly scanning the heavily structured clauses. It was an absolute masterpiece of defensive corporate structuring, drafted by someone who clearly understood that blood loyalty was completely worthless when millions of dollars were on the line. The real power lay in the attached addendum. I read the collateral clauses twice to ensure I was not misinterpreting the archaic legal phrasing. The collateral attached to my mother's massive financial injection was not a simple cash repayment or a standard lien on rolling truck inventory. It was a highly aggressive equity conversion mechanism. If the company defaulted, or if there was an active, documented attempt to defraud the debt holder or their designated heirs regarding the true ownership structure, the debt instantly and irrevocably converted into a controlling interest of the collateral assets. I immediately cross-referenced the property schedules attached to the back of the addendum. My breath hitched in my throat. The collateral was not generic corporate stock. It was the entire Eastern Seaboard cold storage network. It was the highly lucrative commercial retail blocks situated right in the center of the downtown district. It was the exact, specific portfolio of assets my uncle had just pompously handed over to my cousin mere hours ago, acting as if he were a feudal king bestowing a divine right upon his heir. I turned back to my encrypted workstation, my mind shifting into high gear. How on earth did my uncle think he could get away with this? I started mapping the corporate entity history using the public registry databases. Over the last decade and a half, my uncle had engaged in a classic, aggressive restructuring tactic known as a shell game. He had methodically moved the prime real estate assets out of the original logistics company, nesting them securely under a dizzying, complex array of brand-new limited liability companies. He had fractured the ownership, created phantom holding companies, and layered the deeds to make the original corporate structure look completely empty. He thought he had successfully outrun the ghost of my mother's debt, but he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of secured commercial transactions. You can change the name of the holding company as many times as you want, but you absolutely cannot change the physical dirt. The original promissory note had been secured with a uniform commercial code filing. I pulled up the state registry databases, digging deep into the archived records. The filings had indeed been intentionally obscured by the corporate shuffling, buried deep under layers of new entity names. However, the root identification numbers and the precise metes and bounds descriptions of the real property remained firmly and legally linked to the original lien. The debt had traveled right alongside the physical assets, acting as an invisible parasite feeding silently on the title for over 2 decades. Then, I found the smoking gun. I flipped to the very last page of the physical document resting on my desk. It was a tolling agreement, a legal mechanism designed to extend the statute of limitations on the financial obligation. Right there at the bottom, signed in bright blue ink from exactly 8 years ago, was my uncle's distinct, aggressive, sweeping signature. He could never claim ignorance in front of a judge. He had legally acknowledged the debt, the surviving lien, and the catastrophic conversion rights long after my mother had passed away. I needed to see the exact mechanism of his current trap. I accessed the county probate court's public portal, paid the minimal download fee, and pulled the most recent legal affidavit my uncle had filed just 3 days ago in preparation for the final asset distribution. I scrolled down to page 4, paragraph 7. He had sworn, under explicit penalty of perjury, that the commercial portfolio was completely free of all encumbrances and that absolutely no competing claims existed. I looked back at my mother's addendum, focusing on the bad faith disinheritance clause. The language was utterly bulletproof. By officially swearing a false oath to the probate court to distribute heavily encumbered assets, while simultaneously attempting to financially ruin the direct blood heir of the original note holder, he had committed a catastrophic breach of contract. The dormant security right was no longer sleeping in the archives. His arrogant, documented lie had just made the hostile takeover clause immediately and ruthlessly active. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I did not celebrate. I did not pump my fist in the air. In the brutal world of corporate litigation, I knew exactly what would happen next. I had the smoking gun, but I could not march into a heavily guarded courtroom waving a 20-year-old photocopy. My uncle's extremely expensive legal team would instantly file an injunction, claiming the document was a clever forgery, a desperate fabrication created by a bitter, newly disinherited relative. To force the court and his own attorney to acknowledge the truth without a decade of bleeding legal fees, I needed the original wet ink master copy. Alternatively, I needed the independent custodian who had managed the escrow at the exact time of the signing. I closed my eyes, slowly sifting through the massive mental database of the company's long operational history. Who was actually in the room when my mother saved the empire? Who actually processed those incredibly complex capital injections before my uncle began rewriting history? A name floated to the surface of my memory. It was a name that had been systematically and ruthlessly pushed out of the family narrative almost as thoroughly as my mother's had been. Margot Bell. She was the former corporate financial controller. She was the brilliant, unyielding woman who had worked shoulder to shoulder with my mother during the absolute darkest days of the corporate rescue. My uncle had forced her into early retirement over a decade ago because she refused to cook the books for him. If anyone knew where the original execution copies were buried, it was the woman who had drafted the ledger in the first place. Gemini said, "It took me exactly 55 minutes to drive from my apartment down to a quiet, heavily weathered stretch of Edisto Island. The sprawling mansions and manicured lawns of the city gradually gave way to dense maritime forests and narrow, winding asphalt roads. Margot Bell lived at the very end of a dead-end street in a small, single-story bungalow elevated on thick wooden pilings. The light blue paint was peeling, chipped by decades of harsh salt air and coastal storms, but the front garden was meticulously kept. The walkways were swept clean, and the porch furniture was arranged with geometric precision. It was the home of a woman who valued absolute order over superficial aesthetics. I parked my car on the crushed shell driveway and walked up the wooden stairs. I knocked firmly on the screen door. A moment later, the heavy inner door swung open. Margot stood in the threshold. She was in her late 60s now, her hair completely silver and cropped close to her jawline. She wore a faded linen shirt and practical canvas trousers. She recognized me instantly. Her eyes, still as sharp and calculating as I remembered from my childhood, darted briefly to my sedan and then locked back onto my face. She did not unlock the screen door right away. I left that family behind exactly 12 years ago. Riley, Margot said. Her voice was dry, raspy, and completely devoid of any welcoming warmth. I am happily retired. I am done with the corporate world, and I am certainly done with the Mercers. She stepped out onto the porch but kept the wooden screen door firmly between us, crossing her arms over her chest. I stood perfectly still on the top step, letting the coastal breeze pull at the hem of my dress. Your uncle made sure I walked away with nothing but a ruined professional reputation, Margot continued, her tone hardening with old, unresolved bitterness. He told the entire executive board I was an inflexible, rigid accountant who could not grasp modern business strategies. He essentially blacklisted me in the city. All because I flatly refused to authorize Grant expensing a $75,000 chartered flight to the Bahamas as a critical team-building exercise. I am not getting dragged back into whatever mess they have created this time. I did not beg her for help. I did not offer hollow apologies on behalf of a family I was currently in the process of dismantling. I simply unzipped my leather portfolio and pulled out the crisp photocopy of the secured convertible promissory note I had found in the basement. I slid the document under the gap at the bottom of the screen door. Then, I unlocked my phone, pulled up the enhanced audio file from the reading, and placed the device on the wooden railing. I pressed play. Owen's booming, arrogant voice filled the quiet coastal air. He bragged about the commercial portfolio being completely clean and uncontested. He proudly declared his absolute ownership over the very assets that were supposed to be secured. Margot stopped talking. She stared down at the paper resting by her shoes, then looked at the phone broadcasting my uncle's damning lie. She slowly unlatched the screen door, pushed it open, and picked up the photocopy. She walked over to a small wrought iron patio table, sat down, and pulled a pair of reading glasses from her shirt pocket. She read the document in total silence for 3 solid minutes. I watched her fingers, trembling just a fraction of an inch, trace the header of the addendum. "I indexed this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the distant crashing waves. I physically typed the alphanumeric indexing codes for this exact collateral agreement. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp comprehension. "He is publicly claiming the estate is unencumbered. He is lying directly to the probate court." "I only have the copy," I said quietly, taking a seat opposite her. "I need the wet ink original to force an injunction. I need to know where it went." Margot leaned back in her chair, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "When your mother injected that rescue capital, she did not trust your uncle for a single second. She knew exactly what he was capable of doing once the immediate crisis passed. She made me set up an entirely independent document depository, a blind escrow account with a secure firm up in Charlotte." She leaned forward again, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "But there is something else, Riley, something crucial. There was an instructional letter. It was a heavily sealed envelope addressed specifically to the presiding estate attorney. The strict instruction was that it was only to be opened in the event your mother, or her direct descendant, was wrongfully bypassed in the asset distribution. The implication hit me like a physical blow to the chest. If Leonard Pike was actively reading a will that cut me out of the commercial assets, and he had not immediately read that instructional letter into the official record, it meant only one thing. Owen had intentionally removed it from the master file before handing it over to the law firm. "Leonard Pike does not know," I said, the realization settling over me like ice. I thought he was fully complicit. I thought he was helping Owen orchestrate the theft. But he was sweating at the table because he felt the tension, not because he knew the trap. He is flying completely blind. He is executing a doctored file. Margot nodded sharply. We moved inside to her small, immaculate kitchen. I opened my laptop, and we spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing my encrypted digital timeline with her encyclopedic memory of the company's operational history. We needed to pinpoint exactly when Owen had severed the records. We found the pivot point. It was October, exactly 9 years ago. A massive Category 3 hurricane had struck the coast, flooding the downtown district and causing widespread power outages. The basement archives flooded, Margot recalled, tapping a pen rhythmically against her ceramic coffee mug. It was mostly standing water, nothing catastrophic, but Owen used the minor water damage as an excuse to move the primary historical archives to a temporary off-site facility. That was the exact same quarter he started filing the initial incorporation papers for the brand-new shell entities. He used the chaos of the storm evacuation to quietly separate the physical property deeds from the original debt records. I needed absolute, verifiable certainty before I hired a litigator. Sitting right there at Margot's kitchen table, I dialed the corporate number for the independent escrow firm she had utilized all those years ago. I navigated the complex automated menus and finally reached a senior compliance officer. I clearly identified myself as the primary beneficiary of the Elaine Roberts estate. I provided my social security number, my exact date of birth, and the original 10-digit account routing number Margot had carefully written down on a notepad. The compliance agent placed me on a mandatory security hold. The silence on the line stretched for exactly 4 agonizing minutes. When he finally returned, his tone was strictly professional and deeply cautious. He confirmed that a sealed envelope under my mother's name was indeed sitting securely in their climate-controlled vault. He then stated that the strict, non-negotiable conditions for breaking the seal required a certified death certificate for the original grantor and the physical in-person identity verification of the direct heir, overseen by an officer of the court. I thanked the agent and ended the call. I closed my laptop and looked across the small wooden table at Margot. She was smiling. It was not a warm, grandmotherly smile. It was a hard, sharp, fiercely vindicated smile that perfectly mirrored the one spreading across my own face. My parting words to the sweating lawyer had not just been a tactical bluff designed to shake my uncle's unearned confidence. It was the absolute, undeniable truth. The highly paid, prestigious estate attorney was currently staking his entire career, his firm's pristine reputation, and his professional license on a hand of cards that had been secretly stripped of its aces. Owen was betting his entire stolen empire on a pathetic game of hiding documents, completely unaware that the brilliant architect of those very documents had just joined my side of the table. Gemini said, "It took exactly 48 hours for my uncle to launch the public smear campaign. He did not issue a formal press release or a dignified statement through his corporate office. He went directly to social media, weaponizing the local Charleston business community through a highly calculated narrative of victimhood. Sitting in my home office, I watched his post go live. He uploaded a carefully selected photograph taken over a decade ago at a Thanksgiving dinner. In the picture, he was standing at the head of a massive dining table, carving a turkey with a benevolent, patriarchal smile, while I sat quietly in the background, looking young and completely out of place. The caption was a masterclass in manipulative public relations. He wrote a sprawling 3-paragraph essay about the heavy burdens of family leadership, the tragic heartbreak of ungrateful relatives, and how he had sacrificed his own peace of mind to raise a niece who had just brutally attempted to sabotage a sacred family mourning period out of sheer, unadulterated greed. The engagement metrics exploded almost instantly. Within 2 hours, the post had garnered hundreds of supportive reactions from his country club peers, local politicians, and vendors who depended on his logistics contracts. Grant wasted absolutely no time piling onto the narrative. He dominated the comment section, mocking my professional capabilities. He called me a glorified bean counter who only knew how to read spreadsheets, while the real men in the family built the empire. His fraternity brothers and a dozen distant cousins quickly joined the digital mob, sharing the post and spreading the gossip into the most exclusive dining rooms across the peninsula. I did not type a single word in my own defense. I did not engage. I did not deactivate my accounts to hide from the vitriol. Instead, Margot and I sat side by side at my dual monitors, working in complete, focused silence. We utilized specialized forensic capture software to archive every single post, every comment, and every corresponding timestamp. We were not collecting insults to nurse hurt feelings. We were collecting highly public, legally binding admissions of guilt. In his desperate attempt to control the social narrative, my uncle kept emphatically repeating that he and Grant were the sole, undisputed owners of the commercial properties. He explicitly listed the cold storage facilities and the downtown retail blocks as his exclusive domain. With every boastful comment he typed, he was handing me a pristine, time-stamped record of him willfully violating the bad faith clause of my mother's security agreement. While the public theater raged online, the private legal reality was beginning to fracture. My phone registered 7 missed calls from Leonard Pike between Tuesday morning and Wednesday afternoon. I ignored every single one of them. By Wednesday evening, a highly anxious email landed in my inbox. The estate attorney dropped all of his previous condescension. He suggested we meet quietly for a private, off-the-record cup of coffee to amicably resolve any misunderstandings and avoid unnecessary escalation. I replied exactly 4 minutes later. My email contained only 2 sentences. I politely declined his invitation and explicitly demanded that all future correspondence regarding the estate be submitted strictly in writing to ensure a complete and transparent legal record. I hit send, effectively trapping the terrified lawyer in a paper trail he could no longer control. Then came the surprise move. A blunder so monumental, I actually had to read the financial alert 3 times to believe it. Through my residual access to the Regional Commercial Credit Registry, an alert flagged a massive new inquiry tied to the family holding companies. Grant, overflowing with the unearned confidence of his newly inherited wealth, had just initiated an application for a commercial bridge loan valued at nearly $4 million. He was trying to fast-track funding for a massive, high-end restaurant project he had been bragging about for months. The collateral he listed on the official bank application was the exact same commercial retail block currently locked in the disputed probate file. He was proudly taking his friends out to expensive steakhouses, charging $1,000 bottles of champagne to his credit cards, and loudly celebrating his status as a visionary developer. He was parading around town as a business tycoon, completely oblivious to the fact that pledging encumbered assets for a commercial loan without holding a clear title constituted severe federal bank fraud. I sat back and watched the loan application move through the initial processing phases. I had the power to call the lending institution right then and freeze the transaction, but I intentionally chose to do absolutely nothing. I let the ribbons slide freely through my hands. Every single federal banking document Grant signed, every financial disclosure he falsified based on his father's lie, exponentially weakened their defensive position. They were building their own prison, and I was simply providing the silence they needed to concentrate on the brickwork. However, not everyone in their camp was entirely blinded by arrogance. Talia Boone, Grant's fiancée, made her living as a senior crisis public relations manager for a major firm in Atlanta. She spent her days managing corporate scandals, and she inherently understood the terrifying anatomy of a strategic silence. My absolute refusal to engage in the mudslinging, combined with my total lack of legal panic, deeply spooked her. According to a quiet source I maintained at the country club, Talia cornered Leonard Pike near the clubhouse bar on Thursday afternoon. She did not ask about my emotional state. She looked the attorney dead in the eye and discreetly asked if he had personally verified every single page of the historical corporate archives before reading the will. That single pointed question finally cracked the lawyer's foundation. Leonard immediately drove back to his downtown office, locked his door, and pulled the physical estate binder from his safe. He began to actually scrutinize the documents my uncle had provided, rather than just blindly accepting them. He noticed what I already knew. The paper weight of the asset addendum was slightly, almost imperceptibly different from the rest of the file. He flipped to the bottom corners of the pages and felt his stomach drop. The sequential page numbering was broken. Page 12 jumped abruptly to page 15. The document had clearly been retyped, selectively redacted, and hastily bound together to create a seamless illusion. Leonard realized with a sickening wave of dread that he was not an impartial officer of the court. He was an unwitting accomplice to a massive multi-million-dollar fraud. The trap was now fully set. The tension was stretched to its absolute breaking point. It was time to push them over the edge. On Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, I composed a single email. I placed Owen, Grant, and Leonard Pike on the direct recipient line. I did not include any legal jargon, any emotional appeals, or any threats. The message read exactly as follows. I suggest you immediately halt all commercial transactions, credit applications, and property transfers related to the assets currently being read in the probate proceedings. This is my final courtesy notice. Less than 10 minutes later, my uncle took a screenshot of my email and posted it directly to his social media feed. He added a laughing emoji and a caption mocking my pathetic, desperate attempt to scare a real business out of operating. He publicly dared me to try and stop him, broadcasting his supreme confidence to the entire city. He thought he was publicly destroying my credibility one last time. He had absolutely no idea he had just officially documented his own refusal to mitigate damages, walking completely blind into the final. Fatal snare. Gemini said I needed a gladiator who completely understood the bloody intersection where probate law crashed violently into commercial litigation. I found her in a sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the Charleston harbor. Naomi Kessler was a notoriously ruthless corporate litigator. She did not handle emotional family disputes or hold the hands of grieving widows. She handled complex asset extraction, hostile corporate restructuring, and high-stakes financial warfare. I sat across from her expansive mahogany desk, with Margot sitting quietly to my right. I did not waste her hourly rate with a tragic family history or bitter tears. I simply unzipped my bag and slid the heavy binder of evidence across the polished wood. It contained the clean photocopy of the convertible promissory note, the detailed chronological timeline of the holding company shell game, the audio recording of the reading, and the printed screenshots of my uncle's arrogant, legally binding social media posts. Naomi opened the binder. She did not speak a single word for nearly 45 minutes. The only sound in the office was the sharp turning of pages and the distant, low blast of a cargo ship horn from the harbor outside. When she finally looked up, her dark eyes were gleaming with a pure predatory focus. "This is not a simple will contest," Naomi stated, her voice brisk and entirely devoid of comforting bedside manner. "If we can authenticate your mother's agreement, your uncle is not just being a greedy patriarch. He is actively committing fraud upon the court. He is attempting to distribute a vast commercial estate that he does not legally own in its entirety. It is the exact equivalent of him trying to bequeath a stolen vehicle to his son, while the true owner holds the title." She immediately outlined a brutal two-pronged legal assault. Prong 1 was immediate financial containment. We were going to file an emergency ex parte motion with the Chancery Court to completely freeze every single commercial asset, every operational bank account, and every pending credit application tied to the disputed portfolio. Prong 2 was the fatal strike. We would formally subpoena the entire structural history of his limited liability companies and petition a judge to mandate the unsealing of the independent escrow vault in Charlotte. I reached back into my leather bag and pulled out the final piece of the trap. I handed Naomi the physical emergency support authorization my uncle had tried to force me to sign at the mahogany table, the one demanding I pay the company tax penalty out of my personal savings. Naomi read the document, and a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across her face. "This is phenomenal," she murmured, tapping a manicured fingernail against the paper. "He stripped you of all beneficial interest in the estate, yet immediately attempted to assign you massive financial liability for the exact same estate. He was trying to use your personal funds to plug a corporate leak while actively concealing the true ownership structure from you. This is the absolute legal definition of bad faith. It proves definitively that he knew the financial foundation was rotting before he ever walked into that reading." Margot leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the desk. "I can swear to all of it under oath," she said firmly. "I was the senior financial controller when Elaine injected the rescue capital. I personally indexed the security agreement into the corporate ledger. I can testify exactly how the original accounts were structured before he began intentionally hiding the assets." Naomi looked at Margot, instantly recognizing the immense, devastating value of a credible, hostile insider. Having a former executive validate the origin of the debt elevated our case from a bitter family dispute to a meticulously documented corporate conspiracy. As Naomi began cross-referencing my uncle's recent public court filings with the historical data Margot provided, she paused, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as she highlighted a highly obscure line item buried deep within a consolidated balance sheet from 3 years ago. "Look at this," Naomi said, spinning her large monitor toward us. "For the past 7 years, your uncle's primary holding company has maintained a massive, highly ambiguous consulting reserve fund. It sits completely idle on the books, bleeding value against inflation. You do not park hundreds of thousands of dollars in a vague reserve account unless you are secretly terrified of a massive, impending liability. I stared at the numbers glowing on the screen. He knew. My uncle had always known my mother's ghost was still lingering in the machinery. He had built a secret war chest, hoping he could quietly buy me off with a moderate settlement if I ever stumbled upon the truth. He simply never anticipated that I would find the specific trigger clause that entitled me to the entire kingdom. Just as Naomi began drafting the emergency injunction, her office phone rang. Her paralegal informed her that a walk-in was waiting in the reception area, demanding a strictly off-the-record conversation. Naomi muted the line and looked at me. "It is Leonard Pike." I felt a cold rush of adrenaline hit my stomach. The estate attorney had actually broken rank. We instructed the paralegal to send him in immediately. Leonard looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days. His expensive suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and the arrogant, polished demeanor he had displayed at the will reading was completely gone. He walked into the office, saw Margot sitting next to me, and visibly swallowed hard. "I am not here to violate attorney-client privilege," Leonard began, his voice tight, defensive, and completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. "But as an officer of the court, I have an absolute ethical obligation to ensure I am not being utilized to perpetrate a fraud." He looked directly at Naomi, choosing to ignore me entirely. I reviewed the master estate file my client provided me. The physical paper weight on the asset addendum is inconsistent. The pagination skips from page 12 directly to page 15. I strongly suspect the document I read into the record was heavily redacted and fundamentally incomplete. Naomi leaned back in her high leather chair, steepling her fingers. "Suspecting a forgery and proving it are two entirely different animals. Leonard, why are you sitting in my office instead of resigning from his legal representation?" Leonard wiped a shaking hand across his forehead. "Because if I publicly accuse him without absolute, irrefutable proof, he will destroy my firm. He will sue me for malpractice and breach of confidentiality. I know the two of you are maneuvering. I am simply stating that if a fully authenticated, original document were to miraculously surface from an independent third party, I would have no choice but to immediately halt the probate process and formally notify the presiding judge of the discrepancy." He was terrified, but he was also handing us the key to the castle. I did not trust Leonard for a single second. He was a coward trying desperately to save his own legal license. But sitting in that office, I realized his cowardice was our greatest asset. He was no longer the mastermind I originally thought he was. He was the perfect, highly credible star witness. When the time came, the very lawyer who read the fraudulent will would be the exact person forced to tear it to shreds on the courtroom floor. Leonard left the office looking like a man walking to the gallows. Once the heavy glass door clicked shut, Naomi did not hesitate. The trap was perfectly primed. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night when Naomi finally hit the execution key on her keyboard, officially submitting the 70-page emergency injunction to the county court's electronic filing portal. The digital timestamp glowed brightly on the screen, marking the exact moment my uncle's stolen empire was legally frozen in place. I walked out of the high-rise office building and stepped into the humid coastal night air. The streets of Charleston were completely empty. For the first time since I was 22 years old, I closed my eyes and took a massive, deep breath. The suffocating tightness in my chest that I had carried for over a decade finally began to crack. I was not breathing easily because I felt safe or because the war was over. I was finally breathing easily because, after years of fighting shadows in the dark, the real battle had finally begun on the exact battlefield I had chosen. My uncle did not retreat. Within 48 hours of Naomi filing the emergency injunction, Owen retained one of the most aggressive, notoriously expensive corporate defense firms in the state of South Carolina. They hit back with a brutal, heavily publicized counterfiling. Their legal narrative was simple, vicious, and highly effective. They claimed I was a bitter, deeply unstable niece who had maliciously fabricated an obsolete, long-expired debt note purely to terrorize my grieving family and extort a massive financial settlement. Because Naomi and I only possessed a clean photocopy of the addendum, the Chancery Court judge hesitated. The judge flatly refused to issue a blanket freeze on the entire commercial portfolio until the wet ink original could be physically examined in chambers. It was merely a procedural delay, a tiny temporary legal gap, but to my uncle, it was a massive vindicating victory. Owen wasted zero time exploiting that temporary judicial hesitation. He immediately called every single relative, local politician, and business partner, boldly declaring that a judge had practically laughed my fraudulent claims straight out of the courtroom. Emboldened by this false triumph, Grant decided to turn his previously planned intimate engagement dinner into a massive, sprawling gala at the most exclusive country club in the city. He invited over 200 guests, specifically making sure to include every single person who had witnessed my initial humiliation at the original will reading. The family grapevine turned completely toxic. The whisper campaigns painted me as a deranged, vengeful woman actively trying to destroy a sacred mourning period out of sheer spite because I did not get my name on a lucrative building. I was completely isolated, cast perfectly as the villain in a story they were writing in real time. Then, a highly unexpected email arrived. Leonard Pike formally issued a legal notice for a supplemental reading and clarification of the estate. He framed it in his correspondence as a necessary, transparent administrative step to quell the unfortunate family tension and officially finalize the asset distribution on the public record. Owen eagerly agreed to the meeting. He saw it as the perfect, highly official stage to finally crush my rebellion and force me to publicly concede defeat in front of the estate attorney. Sitting in Naomi's office, my lawyer strongly advised me to decline the invitation. She paced aggressively across her Persian rug, warning me that it was an obvious public relations trap designed to box us into a corner while we waited for the court orders to process. But I looked at the date on the formal notice and smiled. I told Naomi I would attend, but only under two extremely strict conditions. First, the entire proceeding had to be transcribed by a certified, independent court reporter. Second, the commercial lenders currently processing Grant's multi-million-dollar bridge loan applications had to be present in the room to hear the final, undisputed clarifications of title. Naomi thought I was willingly walking into a firing squad, but I had a separate piece of the puzzle she did not fully see yet. Behind the scenes, I had been working relentlessly with the compliance officer in Charlotte. The independent escrow firm had finally reviewed my sworn affidavits and the preliminary court docket. They agreed to a highly specific, unbreakable release protocol. They would not mail the document, but they would send an authorized, heavily bonded courier to hand-deliver the sealed envelope directly to the presiding estate attorney. The twist was the precise timing. The courier was scheduled to arrive at Leonard Pike's office at the exact moment the supplemental reading was set to begin. The envelope would be unsealed right there on the mahogany table, directly in front of the lawyer, the moment I presented my physical identification alongside a court-appointed notary. Every single piece was finally locking into a lethal, inescapable grid. To make the trap work flawlessly, I needed Owen to feel completely invincible. I needed him to walk into that law office so blinded by his own arrogance that he could not see the cliff edge until he was already falling. So I did the unthinkable. I actually attended Grant's engagement party. I wore a plain, unassuming gray dress that I had owned for 5 years. I did not wear makeup. I intentionally let my shoulders slump, projecting the precise image of a thoroughly beaten, exhausted woman who had finally run out of options and capital. For 3 excruciating hours, I stood quietly near the back of the lavish ballroom, sipping sparkling water while relatives shot me dirty looks and whispered behind their manicured hands. Grant paraded Talia around the room, loudly boasting to his fraternity brothers that the minor legal hiccup was completely handled and the commercial properties were indisputably his to develop. Every time Owen caught my eye from across the room, his chest puffed out just a fraction more. He spent the entire evening loudly reassuring his nervous investors that his ownership of the estate was absolute, final, and entirely unassailable. I absorbed every insult, every mocking laugh, and every boastful lie without saying a single word in my defense. I let them believe they had broken me. By midnight, the lavish party was finally winding down. I slipped out through the heavy side doors and walked alone into the sprawling, dimly lit parking lot. The humid night air wrapped around me, a stark contrast to the chilled, artificial atmosphere of the ballroom I had just escaped. I leaned against the driver's side door of my sedan and pulled my phone from my purse. The screen illuminated the darkness, casting a pale glow across my face. Sitting perfectly unread in my inbox was the final, encrypted confirmation email from the Charlotte Escrow Agency. The bonded courier was locked in for exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. I stared at the digital letters glowing against the black background. A cool, absolute calm washed over me, steadying my racing pulse. I looked back up at the brightly lit country club, where my family was currently raising expensive champagne flutes to toast their stolen wealth and my supposed devastating defeat. They thought tomorrow's supplemental reading was going to be a public execution where I finally dropped to my knees and begged for whatever scraps they deemed me worthy of receiving. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into that room and detonate their entire empire. The mahogany conference table at Leonard Pike's downtown law firm was significantly larger than the one at the estate, yet the room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the morning on a bright Tuesday, but the heavy motorized blinds were drawn tight, casting a sterile, fluorescent glare over the gathering. The audience had doubled since the initial reading. Alongside the usual flock of hovering relatives, there were now two senior vice presidents from the regional commercial bank sitting rigidly in the corner. Naomi sat to my right, her posture impeccably straight, arranging a stack of meticulously tabbed folders. The heavy glass door swung open, and my uncle strode into the room. He did not walk like a man facing a serious legal injunction. He walked like a reigning monarch annoyed by a peasant uprising. Grant trailed closely behind him, holding his smartphone high in the air, the recording light glowing a steady red. He was actively filming a social media story, panning the lens across the room to capture what he firmly believed would be my ultimate, agonizing humiliation. Owen took his seat at the head of the table, shooting a look of pure theatrical exhaustion toward the bank representatives. "I sincerely apologize for dragging you all out here," Owen announced, his voice carrying that familiar booming arrogance. Apparently, my niece is intent on dragging up ancient, irrelevant history just to disrupt our family mourning period for a second time. Let us get this theatrical nonsense over with. I did not take the bait. I simply looked at the heavy oak doors. Right on cue. Exactly 2 minutes past the hour, a uniformed, heavily bonded courier stepped into the conference room. He carried a fireproof lockbox. The room fell into an abrupt, uneasy silence as the courier approached the head of the table. He requested my government identification, verified it against his manifest, and required the court-appointed notary to stamp the delivery log. Only then did he unlock the box and extract the thick, cream-colored envelope bearing my mother's handwriting and the unbroken red wax seal. The courier handed the sealed envelope directly to Leonard Pike. The attorney's hands were visibly shaking as he broke the wax and pulled out the crisp, perfectly preserved documents. He laid them flat on the polished wood. First was the personal directive letter from my mother, and right beneath it was the fully executed, original addendum confirming the absolute security rights attached to the very assets Owen had just tried to give away. I watched Leonard read the first page. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He flipped to the second page, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text. He was not just reading a document. He was reading his own professional obituary. He realized in real time that the master file Owen had provided him the previous week was fundamentally, intentionally gutted. The core structural truth of the entire estate had been hidden from him, and he had blindly sworn to its validity in front of a probate judge. His pristine, 40-year legal reputation was suddenly teetering on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. Owen, sensing the drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure, leaned over and snatched the document right out of his lawyer's trembling hands. He scanned the paragraphs, his jaw tightening, but he quickly forced a dismissive, patronizing bark of a laugh. "This is completely ridiculous. Owen declared loudly, tossing the paper back onto the table. He looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the banking executives to reassure them. This is a 20-year-old piece of paper. The initial loan term expired over a decade ago. It is legally dead. It has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on my sovereign right to distribute my unencumbered property today. This is a desperate, pathetic stunt. A few of the distant relatives murmured in agreement, the tension briefly breaking. Grant smirked, lowering his phone just a fraction. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply opened her first tabbed folder, extracted 3 stapled packets, and slid them smoothly across the expanse of the long table. They came to a halt right in front of my uncle. "An expired debt, you say?" Naomi asked, her tone entirely conversational but laced with a lethal edge. "If the obligation died a decade ago, Mr. Mercer, then why exactly did you personally sign these tolling agreements? You extended the active life of the debt year after year. The most recent reaffirmation was signed in blue ink exactly 3 years ago. You legally acknowledged the debt, the surviving lien, and the catastrophic conversion rights long after your sister passed away. The debt is not dead. It is fully awake, and it is starving." Owen stared down at his own sweeping signature on the photocopies. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug, patrician mask finally began to slip, revealing the terrified, cornered man underneath. It was Grant who broke the silence, his temper flaring as he slammed his hands down on the table. "So what?" Grant yelled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "So we owe her some money. We will write her a check tomorrow morning with interest. The cold storage buildings and the retail blocks are still mine. My father gave them to me. The debt does not change the fact that I own the property. It was the exact, spectacular blunder I had been waiting for him to make. He thought he was saving his father, but he had just kicked open the door for the final, devastating strike." The entire room went dead silent. The bank representatives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, their eyes darting between Grant and the documents. I finally moved. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a single, neatly printed piece of paper. It was not a 20-year-old document. It was fresh. I did not slide it to Owen. I stood up and placed it directly in front of the 2 senior vice presidents from the commercial bank. It was a flawless copy of the federal commercial bridge loan application Grant had submitted exactly 72 hours ago. "If you acknowledge that this massive debt exists, Grant," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room, "and if you claim that you are the sole rightful owner of those properties, then you have a very serious problem. Because on page 4 of this federal banking application, you and your father both signed your names swearing that those exact same properties were entirely free and clear of any and all financial encumbrances." Nobody breathed. The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Grant and Owen had just openly admitted to the debt in front of witnesses, directly contradicting the legally binding financial disclosures they had just submitted to a federally insured institution. It was no longer just a family dispute over a will. It was documented, irrefutable bank fraud. The senior vice president closest to the document stared at the application, his expression hardening into pure ice. Grant looked wildly between me, the bankers, and his father, the realization of his catastrophic mistake finally sinking in. But I did not deal the killing blow. Not yet. I left the loan application resting on the table, turning my gaze away from my ruined family. I looked directly across the mahogany expanse at the sweating, paralyzed estate attorney. He was staring at the undeniable proof of the perjury he had unknowingly helped facilitate. I held his terrified gaze for 5 agonizing seconds, letting the silence stretch until it was practically screaming. "Lawyer," I said softly, the echo of my previous warning ringing through the shattered room. "You really do not know." Gemini said I stood up, pushing my chair back against the thick carpet. The sound was deafening in the absolute quiet of the conference room. I kept my eyes locked on the estate attorney. I did not raise my voice, but I let the cold certainty of the moment carry my words across the polished mahogany. "Lawyer, you really do not know. I repeated the exact question I had asked him at the very first gathering. I reached across the table and tapped my index finger against the bottom paragraph of my mother's letter, the one that had just been unsealed from the Charlotte vault. "Read the springing proxy clause," I instructed him. Leonard's eyes darted down to the text. I did not need to wait for him to comprehend the archaic legal phrasing. I had spent years memorizing it. My mother knew exactly what my uncle would attempt the moment she was no longer in the room. I explained to the paralyzed audience. She explicitly stipulated that if the managing partner or his designated heir ever made a fraudulent, documented declaration of unencumbered ownership in an attempt to disinherit her direct bloodline, the security agreement would not simply convert into equity. It triggers an immediate, irrevocable springing proxy. Naomi stood up beside me. She opened her final tabbed folder and pulled out a certified digital receipt from the escrow agency, stamped with a time exactly 48 hours after the initial will reading. That proxy was officially activated the moment your uncle stood in the family library, publicly claimed the commercial assets were uncontested, and simultaneously attempted to coerce my client into personally funding your corporate tax liabilities, Naomi stated, her voice slicing through the room like a newly sharpened blade. You triggered the hostile takeover clause yourselves. Leonard Pike physically recoiled from the documents on the table. The blood had entirely left his face. He realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. The entire foundation of the estate he had confidently read into the public record was completely fictitious. The massive commercial assets my uncle had arrogantly distributed were never his to give away in the first place. But the absolute worst realization had not yet hit the room. I turned my attention to Grant, who was still staring at the federal bank application sitting near the bankers. This is not just a dispute over who gets the largest slice of the pie, I told my cousin. The springing proxy means I have the immediate legal authority to demand a complete administrative freeze on all holding companies. I now have the power to force a forensic audit of every single transaction made since the funeral. And most importantly, I have the absolute right to unilaterally void any commercial commitments you have signed based on your completely fraudulent declarations of ownership. The two senior vice presidents from the commercial bank did not need to hear another word. The taller executive immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, angry motion. He looked directly at Grant, completely ignoring my uncle. "We are officially halting all processing on your bridge loan applications effective immediately," the banker announced, his tone dripping with professional disgust. "Furthermore, our legal department will be issuing formal preservation notices regarding the federal applications you submitted under penalty of perjury." "Good morning, gentlemen." The bankers walked out of the glass doors without looking back. The sound of the door clicking shut shattered whatever fragile delusion Grant was still clinging to. The reality of federal fraud charges and utter financial ruin finally crashed down on him. He spun around, his face contorted in sheer panic, and turned completely on his father. "You told me it was handled," Grant screamed, his voice cracking loudly in front of the entire assembly of relatives. He pointed a trembling finger right into Owen's face. "You swore to me the assets were clean. You told me she was just a glorified secretary. You made me sign those federal documents." "Keep your mouth shut, Grant," Owen roared back, slamming his fists onto the table. He turned toward me, his face purple with absolute, unfiltered rage. "You are stealing my legacy. You are a thief. I built this empire with my bare hands, and you are trying to hijack it on a technicality." He looked ready to lunge across the table, but Naomi simply slid a massive, bound stack of litigation filings right into the center of the wood. "Scream all you want, Mr. Mercer," Naomi said calmly. "We have the transcribed recordings. We have the independent escrow certificates. We have the authenticated addendum. We have your own time-stamped public social media posts claiming absolute ownership. We have submitted every single piece into the official Chancery Court docket. You can try to spin a tragic emotional narrative to your friends at the country club, but this is no longer a family disagreement. It is an airtight, undeniable chain of legal events." Leonard Pike finally moved. He did not try to defend his wealthy client. He did what any terrified, self-preserving attorney would do when staring down the barrel of a massive malpractice suit and potential disbarment. He immediately threw my uncle straight under the bus. "Let the official transcript reflect," Leonard said loudly, directing his words to the independent court reporter furiously typing in the corner. "Let it reflect that the initial reading of the estate was conducted under the direct, false premise that the provided master file was complete. As an officer of the court, I am formally petitioning for emergency judicial supervision to completely redistribute the estate, pending a full verification of the foundational ownership." It was over. It was not a cinematic explosion, but the quiet, decisive snap of a bear trap closing perfectly on its target. In the weeks that followed, the consequences were brutal and absolute. Under the crushing pressure of the probate court, the furious commercial creditors, and the looming threat of federal fraud investigations, my uncle completely capitulated. He was forced into a humiliating settlement negotiation. He had to legally restore my full ownership rights, completely open the rotting corporate books to my forensic team, and immediately liquidate several of his prized, non-core assets just to cover the crippling legal fees and the outstanding corporate debt he could no longer hide. Grant lost his golden heir status overnight, forced to abandon his extravagant restaurant projects and face the cold, hard reality of his own sheer incompetence. I did not stay to watch them tear each other apart. I did not pop a bottle of expensive champagne or move into the cavernous, drafty mansion. I packed up my apartment in Mount Pleasant and completely severed my ties with the toxic ecosystem of the local elite. I took the massive, legitimate cash flow recovered from the commercial portfolio and established a dedicated, ironclad trust. I named it the Elaine Roberts Business Recovery Fund. It was specifically designed to provide aggressive, top-tier legal and forensic support to competent professionals who found themselves systematically sidelined, exploited, and cut out of their own family businesses. I finally found my peace, but it was not through their apologies or their sudden, desperate attempts to welcome me back into the fold. It was through a single, cold truth that had kept me alive during the darkest years of my life. They can spin their tragic tales. They can cry in public and tell stories about you to anyone who will listen. But in the end, the paperwork is the only thing that tells the absolute truth. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. I also invite you to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.